and today we're going to do a highlight on how to grow Pinguicula Primuliflora. So Pinguicula Primuliflora is a really special ping. It is a different kind of ping than we normally talk about. So you see us talk all the time about the Mexican or tropical Pinguicula, which we also call the houseplant pings. This group of Pinguicula does really, really well indoors, right? But there are two other broad groupings of Pinguicula. There are the temperate pings that actually grow in kind of colder weather, and then there are the warm temperate pings. And these all grow generally in the southeastern coastal plain of the United States, which is where the Sarracenia grow. So they grow in very similar plant conditions as the Sarracenia. So that gives you a clue to how you care for them. The clue is in kind of those grouping names: tropical pings, warm temperate pings, and temperate pings, right? So Primuliflora care is a little bit different than how we would recommend you care for these guys. These guys really like to be indoors. They don't like to be experiencing a whole lot of fluctuation in temperature. They really like to dry out a little bit between waterings. They have a very dry soil mix. Very different for this particular plant. So I'm going to give you some really specific care instructions for Primuliflora. And that's because this is probably the easiest of the warm temperate pings to grow. It's also the most readily available. You can apply these instructions to most of the warm temperate pings. There's, of course, a little bit of nuance among the species, but these are generally good care instructions for all of them. So let's talk about Primuliflora and why it's so wonderful and how to care for it. So there's always the basics with these plants, right? Where do they grow naturally? That's always the first clue. And I always recommend you look up, where do these plants grow? What is that condition like? Because that's going to give you a lot of good tips on how to grow them. Primuliflora specifically grows in Florida and Louisiana, where it grows often in kind of the shadier areas of very wet areas in peat mossy, kind of very wet soil. So it grows wet and it grows just a little bit shaded from the heat. Even it grows in a very hot place. That's your first two clues on how to grow this differently than other plants. So where can you grow this? So in general, in many areas, you can grow these outdoors alongside Sarracenia and flytraps if you're successfully growing those outdoors. There are, of course, some key differences, which we'll review. They make a great companion plant for those, and they're really fun because they have these really cheerful flowers, they have these beautiful rosettes, and it's nice to add that to your collection because while flytraps and Sarracenia have cool flowers, they're not like the most spectacular flowers of all time. Sarracenia having better flowers than flytraps, of course. So it's really fun to have something with these beautiful little purple flowers with that yellow throat. And when you get a clump of them, they'll all flower at once, and it's really, really beautiful. It's just a fun addition. It's also nice just from an actual, gardening style to have such a low-lying plant as opposed to all the tall Sarracenia and even the taller flytraps. It's nice to have that staging, right? So you can have some foreground plants, some midground, and some back, right? This is a great foreground plant. So I recommend you can grow this outside in a pot, but I actually really like to grow them nestled in with my plants. So my tip is that I grow them with my Sarracenia. And that is because for these guys, they don't actually want to be in like the full baking hot sun like a Sarracenia does. What they want is full morning sun with a little protection from those few hours of super intense, afternoon sun that are very hot and very, very, very intense. Those few hours can dry them out, can kind of make these little leaves turn brown. So you either want to grow them where they're going to get full morning sun but protection from the afternoon sun, under some 30% shade cloth potentially, or you can grow them with your Sarracenia right here, nestled in at the root of the Sarracenia, and make sure that the Sarracenia is going to shade them as the sun goes over the plant. That's how I like to grow mine. But you can grow them any way you want that works. Now, the other thing about these plants is they do like a peat moss and perlite mix, just like the Sarracenia and the Venus flytraps. They don't want that rocky soil like these guys. They want to be wet, wet, wet all the time. They do have very short roots, just like these guys, so don't expect them to have like really long, deep roots. And even really happy plants are not going to have like these extreme roots. They also really like to be wet. So you always want to use reverse osmosis, rainwater, or distilled water, because those waters don't have minerals and salts in them. That's really what you're looking to avoid. It's not going to help for you to leave your water out overnight to let the chlorine dissipate. That's not helpful. What you really need to do is make sure your water has no dissolved minerals and salts. Now, these guys really want to be very wet. So one of Peter's personal tips is he likes to flood them with water. And that means you want to water them from overhead in the summer and really just pour that water all over the top of the plant. And you can even let the water sit on the top of the plant, but I like to make sure that that water drains away by the end of the day. You really don't want it to sit for days and days underwater, although in nature, many of the warm temperate things are flooded and like deeply underwater. If you look up Pinguicula planifolia, for instance, Cerulean, lutea, these are the other warm temperates, and you can see some really cool pictures of them. Anyway, back to Primuliflora. So definitely flood these, especially when it's hot and you really want to give them a little break. They love that flooding. That's one of Peter's special tips. So you want to protect it from that warm afternoon sun. You want to make sure it's very wet. You want to make sure it's in a peat mossy, wet, rich, like ability to hold all that water soil. You can fertilize it with an application of the Schultz cactus fertilizer, which is the same thing we use on these. 1 to 2 times a month, just mist it on the leaves. And then when it comes to repotting, you do want to repot these plants every few years, just like any other plant. But one of the things that's special about this plant is that it will make new plants from the leaf tips. So a happy plant, especially grown in that nice moist peat moss, will root down this little leaf tip and make a baby plant. And oftentimes you'll see that when you even order them because they just are so prolific at it. They'll have tiny little stars growing off all of these. Now, I like to leave those and let them form a beautiful cluster because, you know, these are not plants that necessarily live forever. The mother plant may die, and then you have all these beautiful new plants, and you have this beautiful sustained ecosystem of plants. But if you do want to separate them, wait for them to get a bit of size, like a good ½ an inch, before you separate them from the mother plant. But that's one of their special tricks, and it's really, really fun. So let's talk about some of the extremes, right? What if you live somewhere very cold or somewhere very hot? What's too hot? What's too cold for this particular plant? So he really doesn't want to get colder than 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Even in our area, we do want to be kind of thoughtful of that when we have our brief freezes. So as long as it warms up during the day to the 50s or 60s, usually that's fine for them. But if it's going to be sustained frost for like weeks, a couple of weeks, or it's not actually going to get back up above 40, 50 degrees during the day, this plant is not going to be happy outside. You could mulch it in extremely heavily with 3 to 4 inches of mulch, but there is a risk of rot. So for a plant like this that doesn't really do a traditional winter dormancy, so you don't have to worry too much about that, you can bring this inside for winter if you live somewhere very, very cold. Now, what if you live somewhere very hot? What is very hot? Let's qualify that. So they can take up to 100 degrees, a little up 100 plus. We have days here in the summer where it can be up to 108. But again, our temperatures drop back down at night by like 10 to 20 degrees, which is what they need. They need that break. And then the next day, we might have that heat wave for only a few days. We do not get extended heat waves. And they really don't want to be 105 degrees for weeks and weeks and weeks on end. And if you're in a very dry climate like Arizona, the combination of the heat, the sun intensity, and the lack of humidity, that's going to be hard on this particular plant. Think where it grows naturally. Think about how humid Florida is. So while Florida is very hot, if this is grown in the nestled down in the grass at the edge of a beautiful seepage, and it's really, really wet, it's not getting full sun, and it's getting a ton of humidity, that's what can offset those hot days for it. So that's what you're going to have to do. If you want to grow it in a climate that is both not terribly humid and consistently very hot, you are going to have to provide for it protection from the sun, lots of water, so that it can kind of always be moist. But that's going to be tough. So honestly, if you live somewhere extremely hot and dry like Arizona, this plant is not going to do well outdoors for you, and I don't necessarily recommend it. But you can definitely try it and definitely prove me wrong, because that's like my favorite thing ever. I want to hear about your plant successes. And actually, if you do grow this in a place that's extremely cold or extremely hot, I want to hear your tips in the comments. So anecdotally, I also know that from the thousands and thousands and thousands of customers that I talk to all across the United States and the world, this is actually not a plant that does well inside under grow lights, which is kind of interesting, right? It has a tendency to get fried by grow lights, and it really wants to be super wet. So if you're going to try to grow this indoors under grow lights, I recommend you actually grow it either farther from the grow lights or to the side. It doesn't want to be like cooking under a grow light. These guys cook them under a grow light. They want to be close to that grow light. They want that grow light on 12 hours a day. This is going to fry. And that's really what I see. The biggest problems I see with this plant are about acclimation and rot. So let's talk about those two things. When you get this plant, acclimating it out is very important, right? Because it is tender. It's got those juicy, sweet little leaves. And if you just pop this right outside into full sun, you are going to see these leaves kind of fry and turn brown and die back. And while that's not necessarily bad, because some leaf turnover is totally, totally okay and normal, that could be harsh, and you might take a really long time recovering your plant. Now, an important tip is to remember that this right here, this new growth here, this is the center of the plant. That's the beating heart of this plant. So as long as that looks healthy and green, your plant is okay. But if that starts to look brown or like weird purple fungusy rot, you've got a problem. It can keep growing though. Even if you burn these leaves, it can surprisingly bounce back. But my recommendation would be to acclimate it slowly over the course of 1 to 2 days. And again, you can expect to see some browning leaves. Carnivorous plants in general have a very high leaf turnover rate, meaning their leaves die back and new ones grow in. Don't panic, okay? But if you see it like starting to really crisp up and turn brown, that is because it wants to be a little wetter, a little more humid, and a little less light. And you can kind of judge those things. And again, some of that's going to be normal and natural, and some of that is going to just take a little time for it to get used to. But if you're seeing every single leaf have a really bad reaction, that's a sign that your plant is telling you, I'm not wild about how fast I was moved or the conditions I'm in. So you're going to want to increase water, reduce light, or even if you can, increase humidity. All right, so I'm in my backyard with my Sarracenia because, as I told you earlier, I like to grow my Primuliflora tucked into my bogs. Now, these are non-draining bogs. That is another tip. These guys love to be in non-draining bogs. That's always going to be the best case scenario for them. So if you want to look over here, I've got my Primuliflora, and I've actually got them right down here, and they're tucked away, and these Sarracenia actually shadow them from the sun, and it's really easy to water them. So now, there is one cultivar of Primuliflora that is different. You might have heard of this, Primuliflora rose. Oh, it's so pretty. It is a Primuliflora, but it has a double flower. And this is interesting to me because for whatever reason, this plant does not do as well outside in the hustle and bustle as regular Primuliflora. Again, thousands and thousands of customers have talked to me about it. Primuliflora rose, if you want to grow Primuliflora indoors, grow rose indoors. Rose wants to be inside. Maybe it's because it wants to show off its beautiful double flower. Grow it a little to the side of the grow light or farther from the grow light. It is still delicate. It will still fry a little bit. But rose is not necessarily as good at being outdoors as regular Primuliflora. Now again, I know there's exceptions to the rule, and there's probably a bunch of you dying to tell me about how you grow yours outside. And if you do, I want to hear about it and all your conditions because that's really fun for me. But if you do grow rose outdoors, lower light, lots of water, heat waves are going to fry it, so just be thoughtful of that. All right, so I think we've covered everything about the wonderful, weird Primuliflora, which is a warm temperate ping. If you haven't heard of warm temperate pings and you've only heard about beautiful Mexican pings, you should look into them because warm temperates are fun. I really love having the warm temperate ping in my collection. I have a couple. They're so beautiful to see growing in with all of the other plants. They make it a beautiful addition to a bog garden. Or frankly, I just tuck them into my Sarracenia pots because they're cheerful and fun. And they will spread slowly, but they will not take over. They're not going to be crazy and invasive and destroy everything, so you don't have to worry. So just remember those care tips. Treat her with a little bit of extra care, a little bit of extra time and love, and she'll be happy. A little lower light, a little more water, and a little bit of extra time, very carefully watching it and acclimating it. And actually, the best thing about that is, if you do that, you're going to get to know your plant even better. And a lot of being good with plants is just getting to know your plant, understanding the natural cycles, and understanding when your plant's trying to tell you something's wrong. Because there's two different things, right? A brown leaf could be normal, or it could be telling you something's wrong. And that's honestly the trickiest part of being a plant person is knowing, is this a death knell, or is this I'm just dying back? So if you take a little extra time, you're going to learn more about the life cycle of Pinguicula Primuliflora. I hope that helps. And if you have more questions, please comment below. And again, I really do want to know where you grow yours, what your conditions are like, especially if you're in somewhere very hot and dry or very cold. I love to know these things about Primuliflora rose. All right, happy growing.